Minecraft is easily one of the best sandbox games I've ever played in my life. Since I can remember, I've sunk hours into this game just building, and this especially became the case when I discovered the mod Chisel and Bits, which allows you to work with really tiny blocks. With this, I unlocked new levels of environmental storytelling and a deep love for recreating iconic locations and build requests for my Patreon members. But then I found myself in a little bit of a rut. The trends and requests weren't inspiring the same awe inside me, so I took a step back and asked if I built something entirely for me, no expectations, no deadlines, what on earth would I do? How detailed would I get, and what story would that build tell? And that's exactly what we're going to do today as I go through the creation process of one of my most challenging yet fulfilling Minecraft builds to date. Let me present to you the cottage for nobody. But real quick, a word from today's sponsor, OperaGX. Are you a multitasker, a Twitch enjoyer, a gamer, or a silly little guy that enjoys highly customizable browsers? Well then, OperaGX has got you covered. OperaGX is built for those who love to maximize their browser experience with features upon features, which may sound a little overwhelming, but with mods you can flip your entire browser in a single click. And trust me, it's a lot more than just a flashy wallpaper. You can have customized backgrounds, keyboard sounds, moving and even interactive wallpaper, and don't worry, if you're looking for some quiet time, all of these features can be turned off individually with just a click. You can also mix and match various mods from the GX store. For example, I chose the moving wallpaper of a lovely Minecraft cherry biome, but the sounds of music from OperaGX's cozy theme. Also, if you don't want browser music, that's completely chill because OperaGX has an integrated music player that can connect to any music service you prefer. Now you might be thinking, that's a lot of stuff, Sniff, I don't know if my computer can handle all that. Well actually, with GX Control, you can limit your RAM and CPU usage just to make sure that your browser isn't slurping up all of that processing power. Rejoice, multitaskers! You can finally have that YouTube playing in the background while you do your homework and have 16 tabs open while you're also listening to Spotify. And look, I get it. Switching browsers and losing all your bookmarks and extensions can kind of be a lot and a little bit overwhelming. However, OperaGX makes it super easy. You can import all of that with just a click of a button, and OperaGX is compatible with every Chrome extension ever. You can try OperaGX today for free by checking out the link below, and thank you so much to OperaGX for sponsoring today's video. And now back to the video. Before we even get started, there's 3 things we need to get done. We need a subject/reference image, a place to build, and a list of resources. The first thing I always do when I start a project like this is search for some kind of inspiration. As I mentioned before, I usually like to take requests from my Patreon members, which, by the way, you should totally consider joining, but today I was entirely on my own. I knew I wanted it to be a building, not just a room. I wanted it to be idyllic and a subject that wouldn't wear me down only halfway through the project. I'm looking at you, Barbie Sniff. Yeah, my bad. Anyways, I doubt anyone's surprised by the fact that I chose a cottage in the woods. For me, having grown up in a cabin near the woods, it felt familiar, comfortable, and it would be easy to make a bit over the top and fantastical. Okay, great. We have our subject, now we just need a reference. Usually my go-to would be to just scroll through my Pinterest feed. Unfortunately though, Pinterest has become a massive heap of random AI-generated images with totally accurate and definitely not suspicious architecture. It's actually getting kind of annoying. Like, tell me why at this point I'm better off using someone's Sims build as a reference or— oh my god, wait. I'm actually kidding. I didn't do that. Though I did look to some much better Sims builders than I for references. Shout out the Sims players, you guys are amazing. Alright, now with an idea in mind and some vibes, I set out to find the perfect location for my cottage. Theoretically, I could have just landscaped my own surroundings, however, I had the itch to get to Chisel and Bits immediately. Enter Open Terrain Generator. Mwah, how I could kiss this mod, and also I miss it so much. Basically, Open Terrain Generator feels like a precursor to a lot of the other vanilla-esque terrain mods we see today. Instead of adding new mods like Biomes Aplenty, it modifies and adds its own biomes using vanilla blocks. It never fails to make me go, oh. Luckily, this segues us into the last step of our preparations, deciding what mods we want to use. We're already using Chisel and Bits, that we've established, but what else? For starters, flat colored blocks. This gives me an entire tab of just single colored blocks to do my own work with. If you don't want to work with textures, these are perfect. My old Among Us Skeld map was almost entirely flat colored blocks, not a single vanilla texture. Second, we're going to use extra bit manipulation. This mod is single-handedly why I work with older versions of Chisel and Bits because it allows us to carve, sculpt, and rotate bits with a plethora of tools. And finally, we have Cocricot. This is both a resource pack and a mod, and the mod adds so many textures to choose from that would perfectly fit the aesthetic we're going for. Finally, with all of our ducks in a row, we build. I started by prepping the land area first, creating a flat space to build and outlining the general idea of the cottage's footprint. But before I built any walls, I needed to choose the main texture of the house. As I said before, we have a lot of options, but ultimately I decided on these flagstone bricks before constructing walls only half a block wide. Stone as a material for houses has always fascinated me because it's durable, sustainable, and I heavily associate it with building your own home. Where I live, stone houses are not the cheapest to buy or construct and often associated with the wealthy, but there are also old stone homes that have come historically from the not so wealthy, and that's because they did the masonry themselves in a time where it was much more common to build your own house, at least around here. And to me, this is fascinatingly charming and something I have immense respect for. I don't know if you've ever tried your hand at shaping stones for building, but it is incredibly frustrating. Not only that, but usually they gather their own materials from the surrounding area, leading to buildings that are a reflection of the local geology. I think all of this is fitting for the themes of this build, especially since the idea is I am building a home for myself. With the walls concluded, we move on to the roof. There's something very cottagey about a very steep sloped roof, and that's exactly what I went with. Apparently this became a thing for attic space and like as a heating buffer, but as you'll find out later, I did not do an attic, so this is purely decorational on my end and also very torturous. Chiseling roofs is something I tend to avoid at all costs. It's certainly made easier by simple designs like my Barbie dream house or this tiny house, but this design was far from simple. To tackle this challenge, I started by getting all of the edges down first and then working from the outside in, handling each intersecting roof as I came upon it. When I reached that second little slow pop-out section thingy, I realized that this design wasn't feeling dynamic enough and that I needed it to sit a few blocks back to give the building more visual interest. So I began the lengthy process of moving all of the blocks back. However, I think you'll agree with me that this was the right choice. Now, with the dreaded roof done, it was time for the fun part, the windows. I weirdly love windows in Minecraft and in general. I just really appreciate a good sunspot made by a sunny day. To contrast those spiky, pointy rooftops, we're gonna do some soft, organic round windows. I set the door asymmetrically and carved out a space for a large picture window. But then my ADHD called me back to the door. I wanted to give the illusion of a rounded door, so I made this little stained glass window and dove fully into the cheesiness by making a heart with a rainbow background. Now, moving back to that picture window, I began sectioning it off into individual planes. The hardest part about building windows is always making the little framing parts. If you see a measuring tape on my back at any given point, this is part of the Chisel and Bits mod and allows you to measure in bits. It's really helpful if you want to make sure that all of your blocks and placing is really even, and it's a tool that I don't see utilized enough. Just as I was about to finish building the window though, I decided I wanted a bit of movement to it. So I deleted one of the panes and began constructing it slightly ajar, letting in the fresh air. I think little details like this make the build feel less like a house and more like a home. It gives the impression that this is not a static object and that theoretically each window pane could be opened or closed. This is something I really try to push with this build, and we'll see this concept come back for sure. Before I went any further in my window journey, I decided to add a little lip of roof. Not only would this act as a little rain cover, but it would help break up some of the blank space between the walls and the roof area. While I was at it, I also added some additional overhang on the roof, and then I decided that I wanted to bring in some more color to the cottage with some trim. I wasn't sure what color I wanted it to be at first, and initially tried out this dark forest green, but then opted to use the same color as the door. To me, this color works a lot better because it's more of an aqua and doesn't blend in as much with the green surroundings. Finally, we're back to my organic window spree with a round port window in each of the roof faces. Faces? What are these called? Wait. What do you call the flat part of a roof? Like a gable? Isn't that like from Adventure Time? I built a port window in each gable and moved on to the windows on the sides, which ended up being a lot more boxy like your traditional window. Now onto the west side of the house, I knew I wanted the largest window here. This was the perfect spot, since the sun would set and directly filter through it, lighting up the entire house. I spent a long time constructing this window, fiddling around with the frames, even spending a good hour or two trying to make these lattices, and then I didn't really vibe with it. I don't know, it just... Immediately, I thought about destroying it and starting again, but instead, I left it for a while to see if it would grow on me and finish building the other porthole windows. Sometimes when I spend too long on a project, I get really hypercritical of myself. I'm sure plenty of creative people can relate to this. It's just like if I look at it too long, my brain becomes incapable of assessing it, and there have certainly been one too many times in my life where I was in this hypercritical state and actually messed up something really good. So I've learned that sometimes a pause is the best thing you can do. With most of the front windows complete, I briefly took a break to build a chimney and then moved on to those lively details I was talking about earlier. In this case, it was the shutters. It originally started with just one end of the house, where I built a shutter to create more visual interest. I was playing around with the colors for a bit and settled on this sandy wood tone and realized, hey, I like this a lot. Then I moved around, building them on various windows and doing a similar method of building them slightly askew, as if the environment had somehow impacted them or someone had forgotten to close them all the way, which I would totally do.
I'm stupid.
By the time I was done with all of that, I finally accepted that that window was really just messing with my vibes. But instead of destroying it, I moved it to the north wall. And as soon as I finished that, I looked at the giant hole it left, the sun filtering through it perfectly, and suddenly an idea sparked. Considering this project was supposed to be just letting my thoughts run free, I decided, what if I built a greenhouse? Not only would this make perfect use of that beautiful sunlight, but it would also expand the square footage of my already kind of tiny cottage. So I got to work, deciding on this half octagon-like shape. I started with a brick base and built the frames up from there, continuing with my straight walls and 45-degree slants. Unfortunately, this would send me back to chisel and bit roof purgatory. Not only was I making roofs, but I was making window roofs, and working with transparent blocks is so frustrating. At a certain point when I was making the roof slanted on two separate axes, I realized I could just build with solid blocks and replace them with transparent ones after. Oh boy, did this make building so much easier, and this wasn't the only trick I had up my sleeve either. For up to this point, I had only built half the greenhouse, knowing I could flip it with the use of Extra Bit's mirror tool. Seeing it all together definitely made me giddy, but I was a little bit uncertain about the inclusion of the door. I moved it around a bit, but then ultimately decided to scrap the idea of a second entrance in favor of saving that space for decorations and furniture. Now this house was really cooking, so of course this is where it had to all go wrong. One morning, I logged onto my world and I found it completely changed for some reason. The biome had changed or something, which recolored all of the grass, and I don't know why, but this just irked me. It completely threw off the palette I had been curating for the past, now let me check my timer, 7 hours that I had been building. I tried using World Edit to fix it. That didn't work. I tried adjusting the colors in the pack and that didn't work either, so I flew around and searched for a brand new location and moved the entire cabin there. It's fine. It's whatever. I'm definitely not salty about it. I definitely don't miss that beautiful mountain in the backdrop. Well, moving on, we're almost done with the exterior, but I still wanted to add more of those environmental details, and thus I began the dreaded task of adding moss to the roof. Here, my architectural expertise is definitely being thrown out the window, because technically moss on your roof is like not good at all. It can cause a whole laundry list of damage depending on your roof type. However, I recently learned about living roofs, which is like moss on your roof but purposeful. These are actually really fascinating as a concept because it takes what makes moss so harmful to normal roofs and uses it to one's advantage. They help with drainage, have excellent heat regulation, and have positive impacts on the psyche of those around them, especially in hyper-urban areas. Honestly, if I had known more about these, I would 100% have built this to be a living roof. However, I still adore my slightly invasive moss and clay shingles. To add some more whimsy, I built some wisteria gently hanging off the side of the roof above the doorway, along with some more moss and vines around the edges of the roof. I'm sure you can tell by this point, but this took a very long time. If you even mildly like my work, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a like or possibly subscribe. It goes a long way in supporting what I do, and it's completely free and reversible. So why not? Or if you're willing to take it a step further, I did just release merch. It's so colorful and pretty. Ooh, okay, I'm done, I swear. Moving on, at this point, the outside was really coming together, but we still need a few more details. I get asked frequently with these builds, are they laggy? And the answer honestly might surprise you, because it's simultaneously yes and no. I do have a decent computer, which obviously helps things, but when it comes to building with chisel and bits, there are some things I've learned that can optimize it. The main being staying in Minecraft's grid as much as possible and learning to use chisel and bits only when necessary. I think the decor I was doing outside is like the perfect example of this. Obviously, I could have chiseled my own fence or bike or whatever I wanted to, but landscaping around this building really isn't my focus, and I don't want to get lost in details that don't entirely matter and then end up lagging the server before I even finish the build. There are some exceptions to this, of course. I made some flowers a while ago for one of my TikTok builds, and I ended up bringing them into this world because I really appreciated the 3D flora. With all of that said, here is the completed exterior of the house. Whew! Wow, that took a while. Let's go inside. Automatically determining the interior layout of this house was proving to be a challenge. I wanted this to be a house in a kind of studio style manner. Very open concept, yet everything feels like it has a purpose. I knew that I wanted a loft, but not an entire attic, and I didn't want to block any light from the port windows. At first, I tried to build this platform loft, but I found myself really frustrated with how it looked, so I took a break and began to work on the interior walls. I want this house to feel warm and homey and welcoming, so I made use of Cocricot's beautiful wood textures, and then I used chisel and bits to give them a little bit more dimension before I began replacing the walls around the house, including the greenhouse. I continued adding trim along the walls, just adding random layers of textures to create this illusion of intricacy, even though I have no clue what I'm doing. For the wallpaper, I looked at all of Cocricot's wallpapers and chose this very simple, yet very endearing brown one with little anchors on it. However, then the stark white of the windows was messing with the warm vibes of my color palette, so I recolored just the inside frame to match. Now the theme was starting to assemble, but I was also entering a phase of putting trim on every single surface and crevice to avoid dealing with the issue of the house layout. The timber framing reminded me of Tudor house aesthetics, something I'm very fond of for its fairy tale-esque association, and this house was already taken some partial inspiration from it, but it was also a pain in my butt because I was individually placing diagonal planks for what felt like hours. Finally, I reached a point where I had to address the whole interior layout situation, and it was making me really nervous. You see, there's a sort of fun balance you have to come up with these kinds of houses of creating individual spaces yet keeping it open concept. Technically speaking, it would benefit a house like this to have very closed off rooms because heating large rooms, especially ones with these tall ceilings, would be very costly. Now, Sniff, why are you applying real concepts to a sandbox game where you can do whatever you want? I'm not sure. I think in many ways I see my builds as stories. This build inherently tells you a story about the kind of person who built it, who lives in it now, and who might live in it in the future. In regards to who built it, well, I suppose that's me. I grew up in houses that were built by individuals and leaned into aesthetic over practicality in many cases, leading me to like the things that I like now, such as large ceilings. Finding realism to ground your builds is an important factor in making it feel like something you could experience in real life, but sometimes it's even cooler to find realism and purposely subvert it because somehow that makes it more realistic in the first place. People don't always do things because they're optimal, and looking back, that was kind of the entire point of this project. I wasn't just doing this to hop on a trend or to make something for my audience, I was just doing it for myself because I liked it. And with that, folks, I began to solidify my interior layout. I decided on a big open living space with a closed off kitchen and a completely isolated bathroom and a loft above. With the ceiling being so exposed, however, I wanted to give it some extra attention and love, so I built a plethora of crossing beams to support it and once again make it feel as though this house could be affected by its environment and needs additional support. Not only this, but this feature would come in handy later if I wanted to hang plants or lights. I also used this as an excuse to frame the loft area a bit, which I ended up really liking. And finally, after all that fussing, I had completed the interior layout and I could finally furnish this place. This might come as a big surprise, but me, the person that loves to build random interiors in Minecraft, really loves interior design. Shocker, I know. And this time I was giving myself full creative control. The first thing I did was bring in a bed I had actually built a very long time ago. This bed was built for an ancient video on my channel. It's actually nearly 6 years old, and the reason I find myself still incorporating it into builds is just because I really like it. It's certainly a throwback though. The house I originally built it for was one of my largest chisel and bit builds at the time, and I remember being super proud of it. Of course, now I can barely look at it without going, who knows, maybe one day I'll go back and redo it for fun. What would you guys think of that? Let me know in the comments down below. But of course, I also wanted to create some unique pieces for this build, so I started with some wee side tables for the bed, and then hastily moved over to the greenhouse section, where without much thought, I started on a built-in sofa seat thingy with the intention of having this area be a dining room. Kind of. I say kind of because I was unsure if I had space for a desk, and personally my dining room in real life is not really for eating, but like a central table for family activities, meals, and just hanging out. So I was aiming for more of that. Alongside this, I only used about half of the greenhouse space because I wanted to save the rest of it for some plants. Now we boomerang over to the other side of the room where I'm building some bookshelves. I did unfortunately place every book individually, but I do have a pretty good method for creating books in chisel and bits. First, I fill my inventory with the colors I want, build a large brick of layered colors, and then go back and give them various heights and depths, and this works pretty well. I wanted this bookshelf to occupy a pretty decent amount of space in this cottage because reading is one of my more prominent interests. I really enjoy writing and reading stories, and with this cottage being so beautiful and scenic, I could only imagine spending my time here cozying up in a chair and reading till the sun went down. Of course, I'd probably need a chair for that, so as soon as I could, I brought this chair in from my Barbie build along with some curtains. Before recoloring the chair, I decided to blend the curtains into the space a bit better. Fabric is frustrating, regardless of the medium you're using to create or mimic it. However, thinking about how fabric interacts with its surroundings is a quick way to add realistic detail and life to your creations. By having the curtains spill onto the side tables with nowhere to go in such a small space, it really grounds both the curtains and the side tables into the same plane of reality. But enough of that mumbo jumbo, I got a chair to recolor. I changed it to a more leather brown color and built it a little side table because when I sit down to read my book, I'm gonna want a place to put my tea mug. Also, while we're still on the topic of recoloring things, maybe the bed should change too, and the curtains, and the side tables. Look, the color palette is very important to me, alongside the color green in general. This section of the house was really coming together, but it was missing a crucial part: the plants. I'm a big plant guy, if you guys hadn't guessed, and unfortunately, since I'm low-key allergic to the sun and every kind of grass ever, a lot of my plant admiration is confined to the indoors. I started by adding some coquelicot plants first, but as I looked to the other side of the room, I realized I wasn't quite satisfied with my details on the bookshelf, so I took a classic Sniff side quest, added a ladder and some boxes, and then returned back to the plants. While the coquelicot plants are gorgeous, I can't really make them sprawling or draping, so I had to chisel some. Vines are some of the easiest plants to chisel and bit, and my go-to plants in real life. So I opted to create a large pot in the corner with a myriad of vines branching out and spreading around the walls of the house. Luckily, thanks to the sheer amount of beams, this plant had plenty of surfaces to crawl around on. The first plant I ever owned individually was a pothos, and somehow despite nearly 8 years, many weeks of forgetting to water it, and a few moves, I still have a surviving part of it. These are really hardy plants, so if you're looking for a good starter beginner plant, I highly recommend it. Now the interior is looking pretty good, but we're not just gonna leave it here. Since I'm adding things I like, I decided to build an easel. This turned out to be trickier than I expected, because at first I was trying to make it completely from memory before realizing I literally have an easel. I knew I wanted to put this in the greenhouse section since painting near natural light is probably on my top 10 favorite things ever list. I don't get to paint much nowadays because I'm too busy building digital worlds, but when I can, it's certainly a relaxing thing, and at this point this cottage was becoming relaxing central. Anyways, with a few more details, this area was complete and I felt as though it was finally time to move on to the kitchen. I decided on a classic U-shaped setup with a custom-built cabinets and a big farmhouse sink in front of the window. Originally, I intended to have a fireplace stove thingy, but now I opted for one of those retro but fancy stoves. I don't know what they're called, I just know that they look really cool. To achieve a certain level of detail with this, I was going to be utilizing coquelicot textures a lot. Here is where I feel like the combination of chisel and bits and coquelicot really shines, as coquelicot offers a large display of textures that are all similar yet different, and they blend really well with each other. After fiddling around with the top of the stove for what felt like ages, I completed it, and honestly, it's one of my favorite parts of this house. For the cabinets, I brought in some older cabinets I made a while back, but changed them drastically to the point of them not really being the same. Meanwhile, I kept changing the wall and floor textures because I couldn't quite figure out a good fit for this kitchen. I didn't really want the flagstone bricks from the exterior, but I also didn't want anything too visually busy. I also wanted some warmth, and eventually I settled on this plaster and brick combination and made only the bottom cabinets wood. And then I realized I don't have a fridge. Whoops, let's fix that. I love building the vintage rounded fridges so much. I just thought it would fit perfectly here since we already had the vintage-esque stove. At first, I tried really hard to get it to match the black and gold stove, but ultimately decided to just make it cream colored. To maximize the space and bring some of that warmth upwards, I built a cabinet around the fridge and a spice shelf right above it with glass doors. I built some curtains for the windows and began adding the hardware, choosing a worn-out gold to match the accents of the stove. At this point, I also changed the countertop to a cool toned tile for some contrast. To finalize the kitchen, I brought in a little baker's table for an island and added a few details from coquelicot here and there, and this kitchen to me was absolutely perfect. With this and the main room, we're actually nearly done, considering that was over 50% of the house. But don't worry, I won't forget about the loft. First, I had to do a little bit of prep work as I forgot to do some of the trim on this side of the house. This gave it a lot more polish and some much needed intention in this space. I mentioned earlier that I wasn't planning on adding a desk, but here I must admit that apparently I lied, because I did. The easel I built earlier gave me the idea to add some more messy art spaces, since that's a bit of my vibe, unfortunately. In my head, I was thinking mismatched tables, sprawling supplies, and so that's exactly what I did. I even built a book press because I have one that I actually built in real life and I really love bookbinding. Here, I did start to use some of Cokricot's furniture since this wasn't a total focal point, but I continued to chisel details on top of the surfaces. Honestly, I'm kind of jealous of this space. It just looks so cozy and like the perfect crafting area, but also I don't even want to know how someone would go about getting furniture up here. Oh, and of course I built a railing, safety first guys. With that, there was really only so much left to do. The little entryway I originally intended to leave mostly blank, but I ended up adding a little radiator since I wouldn't shut up about heat, and a little bench to take your shoes on and off. Finally, I began adding a couple more plants here and there and realized it would probably be a good idea to have an overhead light, so I built another connecting beam and then used these wicker lights from Cokricot along with some chains and hung them from the ceiling. Theoretically, it was done. And yes, if you were wondering, I did finish building the bathroom. I just don't really enjoy talking about building toilets, and well, even if I wanted to, I couldn't get the footage. Because this entire video, I've been keeping a secret. In the beginning, I happily titled this build A Cottage for Nobody, and it's easy to assume this title is because of the prompt of this build, that I was building it for myself and nobody else, but that's wrong, and I am a part of the group that is nobody. Right as I finished writing the script for this video, I had this idea to do a 3-minute cinematic for this build as a way of kind of doing a final reveal. However, as I began to work on it, I noticed that the world was taking a great toll on my computer, the grass changed again, memory leaks were abound, and it got to the point where I couldn't load it without my computer blue screening over and over again. It might be easy to attribute this to Chisel and Bits, but honestly, it's kind of a whole lot of things, maybe even my computer. Point being though, when I started this project, I actually had the full intention of sharing it, but given the graphical demands, I just don't think it's accessible in the slightest. Which is really unfortunate, but also weirdly poetic. All of this footage is what remains of it, and to me, it's almost peaceful to know that somewhere in this digital world is this cottage. The contents of it telling the story of its owner, the dreaminess of a home, but it's also completely isolated and nearly impossible to visit. It exists by itself and for nobody else, just as it was built to be. I would like to give a huge thank you once again to my Patreon members. I know it might come across like I'm unhappy with their build requests, but that's so far from the truth. They're honestly the highlight of my building, and I think if I didn't have the Patreon build request to get me out of my comfort zone, I wouldn't have had the skill to tackle a project like this. Anyways, with that said, I'm putting a vanilla variation of this cottage up for download. I know it's not exactly the same, but I hope it can at least bring some fun and whimsy. And while my Chisel and Bit builds are a bit more difficult to get up for download, I'm actually working on a solution right now, which is learning Blockbench and modeling my own furniture. It's quite the project, but I'm having so much fun. Here are like some cool mid-century models I've been working on. I hope at some point that I can make my own furniture mod, or like some way for people to like use them in game. I don't know. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and remember to take care of yourself, take care of others, take care of the spaces around you, and have a wonderful day. Cheers.